The CCP has been extremely aggressive regarding Taiwan ever since Pelosi's visit.
In China and Taiwan.
China and Taiwan.
Taiwan in an attack from China.
Beijing now announced that it will hold military exercises.
China responded with military drills. It fired ballistic missiles towards Taiwan and repeatedly rehearsed the assault of Taiwan.
They have launched missiles, sent military ships, and fired fighter jets, all in an attempt to show the USA and the world that the CCP is not afraid to go to war to take Taiwan. But economically, China is struggling. It's going through a massive crash in its real estate market. The population is getting older, and the GDP growth is slowing down for the first time in what seems like forever. As you will see in this video, it's craziness all around. So let's look deeper into if China's fragile economy can afford a war with the USA.
The Chinese economy.
The economy is still being held hostage.
Assessment of the economy, we've seen massive downgrades.
The Chinese government considers Taiwan to be a breakaway region, which it intends to one day seize back.
China has fired multiple ballistic missiles.
President Biden is making clear just how far he'd go to defend Taiwan in an attack from China.
Now, China is facing an economic slowdown, and it's scaring the CCP. The big reason behind this is that China hasn't really had a recession in the past 50 years, which is extremely rare economically speaking. That's not to say they weren't close to a recession, but every time the economy showed signs of slowing down, the government would do something to alleviate the pressure. And it's worked every time, until now. This time around, the situation is a bit unique, and the CCP's old ways will not work in terms of helping this slowing economy. Now you may be wondering what it is that the CCP did before to ward off recessions for the last 50 years. Let's go over that right now, and then we can look at why it's not going to work this time.
China's economy has grown faster than that of any other major country.
China's economy grew a record 18.3% in the first quarter of 2021.
China continues to prosper and grow.
China into a global economic powerhouse, second in GDP only to the United States.
Here is China's GDP for the last 50 years. Pretty impressive growth, right? A lot of this growth is directly linked to its relationship with other countries. Let me show you. This is when China opened its doors to other countries. And this is when it joined the World Trade Organization. You can clearly see from the chart that its economy just exploded once it embraced globalization and trade. Its GDP went from $1 trillion in 1999 to more than $17 trillion in 2021. Trade with the world made China the second largest economy in the world. It is strong, but, well, problems are still there. When we look at GDP per capita, China sits 79th in the world, with only $16,000, which is less than countries like Iraq, Thailand, and Argentina. This means that Chinese people are still relatively poor when compared to Western counterparts. In fact, more than 200 million people in China are still living in poverty, earning less than $5 per day. That number is a lot less than what it used to be a few decades ago, but it's still a lot of people. This is why the CCP's main focus has always been pulling people out of poverty by any means necessary. This is the main driver behind the CCP pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into rural China to help citizens climb out of poverty. And this is all great, and I'm not going to deny that. But things are always more complicated when it comes to the CCP. Let me explain. You see, right after the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, which by the way did not happen if you ask the CCP, the communist government made an unofficial deal with the public. The government would provide rapid growth in the economy and consequentially better living standards for Chinese people. In return, the public wouldn't mind the CCP's overreach into the personal rights of its citizens. I know this is probably not a trade-off many of us would make, but it is the trade-off Chinese citizens made. And if we look back more into China's history, it kind of makes sense as to why they would do this. Over the past 2,000 years, China has suffered thousands of famines, and each of them killed millions of people. There was no food safety, no political stability, and no peace. So for people who have seen their friends and family die of hunger, they would take any deal, as long as it gives them some hope of a better life for themselves and their kids. This is exactly what the CCP offered, a better life at any cost. Ever since then, the CCP's goal has been economic growth and pulling people out of poverty. In return, the public has given up inalienable rights like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to criticize the government.
The architect who laid the foundations for its economic miracle, Deng Xiaoping,
guided China from an impoverished rural country to an urbanized world leader in a single generation.
Under him, private companies were allowed into China along with foreign investment. Deng also created special economic zone.
This seemed like a good deal for the public, as in they got what they wanted. The CCP was able to deliver decades of consistent growth, which was literally life-changing for its citizens. The economy grew, and GDP per capita skyrocketed, going from $300 in 1990 to more than $5,500 in 2010. In a matter of 2 decades, average citizens' wealth grew almost 20 times. People who were born in poor village houses were able to afford high-rises in cities in just one lifetime. They went from having nothing to having access to electricity, airplanes, cars, refrigerators, and much more. If you're a Chinese citizen and your living standards are improving at such a rapid rate, you are probably more than willing to make some compromises with government overreach. The only problem here is that if the growth ever stops, people will start wondering if the trade-off is worth it or not. And that's a really scary prospect for an authoritarian government in a nation of more than 1 billion people. This is why every time global economies faced any turmoil, the CCP was quick to start huge spending projects like the high-speed rails, which was started in response to the 2008 global crisis. The purpose of these projects were twofold. First, they provided jobs for people who were affected by the global economic slowdown, and second, they helped continue the economic growth of China, because their country was growing and needed infrastructure to fulfill the needs of its citizens. This all worked spectacularly, because as the world economy was slowing down, China's economy was still growing at a pretty respectable rate. But the CCP took this a bit too far. Let me explain what problem the CCP faced, and then we'll go into what mistake they ended up making. Let's take a hypothetical village, for example. Citizens of this village have no drinking water. So if the government spent money on building a water well, it will hopefully give some citizens jobs, and it will also provide water for others so they can focus on other productive activities instead of just looking for water every day. Well, that would be considered a productive government project, and most likely, the economy will grow. All other things being equal, of course. But what if the government sees this well and thinks to themselves that if they keep building wells, the economy will keep growing? Well, that's not really true, because the second well probably won't be as useful as the first one, and the third well won't be as useful as the second one, and so on and so on. I'm sure you get the point. If the government continues making just wells, slowly these new wells will be completely useless, and money spent on these construction projects will have no return for the economy. Now, a similar situation started unfolding in China after the 2008 crisis, just at a much larger scale. The CCP had exhausted all the growth out of building high-speed trains. I have covered this in detail in a previous video, which you can check out at the end, but here's a quick recap. The first few trains were good and profitable, but then the CCP kept on building trains even though the return on investment slowly started dwindling. Worse yet, a lot of these constructions were funded by debt, and there was a lot of corruption. It's a pretty long story, so I highly recommend you check out the other video after this. This spending project worked in 2008 to stimulate the economy. But because of this enormous debt, the CCP had created a big problem that would cause a big headache in the future. The CCP also realized something, that they won't be able to keep up with the economic growth through big spending projects, as return on the infrastructure spending is slowly dwindling. That's part of the reason why, for the last decade, China's economic growth has been slowing down.
In focus is China's biggest banking fraud.
Only banking crisis causing social unease.
Another financial crisis is brewing in China, but the world knows very little about it.
For months, they've been frozen out of their bank accounts with 4 rural lenders.
They'd rush over by the hundreds, grab somebody and beat them and kick them, regardless of whether it was men, women, the elderly or children, even people with disabilities.
This is an unsettling prospect for the CCP. China is still a middle-income country, and by some metrics, it's a developing country. Around 200 million citizens still live in poverty, and average yearly income is only around $11,000. This is why when economic growth slowed a little in the early 2010s, the government started encouraging citizens to buy houses. This was their solution to keep the growth going. The CCP loosened the lending regulations and banks started lending to everyone, whether it be companies or citizens. This, in part, helped fuel the growth of China's real estate market, which slowly became a bigger and bigger part of China's economy. The only issue was that this real estate market turned into a ticking time bomb for China's economy. I've covered this extensively in past videos on the channel, so I don't want to repeat the same old events too much. You can check those videos out if you want a big, detailed explanation, but here's a quick recap. As the real estate market became unsustainably big, the CCP realized that this can't continue forever, and they tried reeling it back in an attempt to get things under control. The CCP implemented a so-called 3 red line policy to keep the leverage in the industry under control. This made it harder for companies like Evergrande to continue construction on some buildings they had already sold to buyers. Couple this with the CCP's draconian zero-COVID policy, and it makes sense why the real estate market is near a complete collapse. The real estate market represented 30% of China's GDP and more than 75% of household wealth. A crash in its housing prices means a lot of families who pooled together multi-generational wealth to buy real estate are now suffering. Because of all of these and more, China's economic growth has been rocky. Last quarter, the GDP only grew by 0.1%, and for the first time in 30 years, the CCP is expected to miss the GDP growth target, which was set at 5.5%. This slowdown in China is going to have a ripple effect all across the globe. It's so bad, experts are calling the next 10 years the decade of lost returns. It will bring a period of volatility so high that experts say the classic investing strategies won't survive. So how are ultra-high net worth investors preparing? With an asset that is shown to reduce volatility in any portfolio, one that 85% of wealth managers recommend: blue chip art. Because of the demand in this new era of investing, Deloitte expects this asset class to grow nearly 60% in just 3 short years. And it's no surprise. Morgan Stanley says this art has a low correlation to other major asset classes and doesn't experience the same volatility. But up until now, this art has been reserved for the billionaire class. And that's where one startup saw an opportunity for every investor to be a part of this movement. It's called Masterworks, an easy-to-use investment platform that's allowed over 500,000 users to discover the potential of this exclusive wealth-generating asset. Since inception, their team of art market experts has delivered an average 29% net return to investors. With this decade of lost returns wreaking havoc, demand for Masterworks is exploding. But Masterworks is giving you priority access to skip it. Just click the link in the description. If you go back to the deal with the CCP had with its people, the CCP is expected to provide consistent economic growth at any cost, and in return, citizens overlook the CCP's authoritarian rule. It is much easier to overlook certain things by the government when your salary is increasing every year and real estate investment is always climbing. But in the current situation, this trade-off doesn't seem worth it when economic growth slows down, but the government's authoritarianism only seems to be growing. Just over the last few years, the CCP developed a state-of-the-art tracking system for it to track citizens' every move. Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy has led to some apocalyptic nightmares like this one.
The country's overall policy of zero COVID policy. There are constant lockdowns and mandatory PCR tests around every corner.
Fences to stop people leaving their flats.
Using bicycle locks and padlocks just to keep people in.
Electronic magnetic alarms are going to be placed on the front doors of some people in places where they have tested positive.
And the communist government now also wants to control how Chinese kids spend their free time. Most of you probably already know that China spends the second most amount of money on its military. But what may come as a surprise is the fact that the CCP actually spends even more on internal security than it spends on its military. This has been true for years before the zero COVID policy, but with its zero COVID efforts, I can't imagine how much more the CCP is spending to keep its citizens under control. The only problem now is that people are taking issue with this government overreach, especially with some zero COVID tactics. The CCP has locked people in apartments for weeks, separated elderly from their parents, and even killed off pets, just to achieve an utopia-like zero-COVID goal set by Xi Jinping. The situation has gotten so bad that even people loyal to Xi are now voicing concerns about easing the zero-COVID policy. This is part of the reason why the CCP is screaming so aggressively about Taiwan. It wants to use it as a distraction away from internal problems, which there are plenty of. But screaming about a war and actually going to war are two very different things, and consequences for the latter are extremely dangerous. I'm sure the CCP has been paying close attention to Russia's attack on Ukraine. It was a big surprise for everyone, but especially the CCP, on how quickly and harshly the world reacted in terms of sanctions when Russia launched their invasion. Companies left overnight. Russian banks were kicked off the SWIFT network, and the US froze Russia's foreign reserves. The only saving grace for Russia's economy was that it had oil. China, on the other hand, doesn't. But, okay, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. We'll go over the oil issue in just a minute. But I'm sure some of you are already thinking, China is not Russia. China's economy is many times bigger than Russia's, but it's also very interconnected to the rest of the world, especially to Western countries. Around 1/5 of China's GDP is from its exports, the US being its biggest export partner, accounting for more than $500 billion, or about 17% of all of China's exports. And their dependency doesn't stop there. If you look at China's top 10 export partners, 9 of them are US allies. More than 50% of China's exports are going to countries that are likely to pick the US's side if there was ever a war. Now, some of you might say that I'm wrong to say that China is dependent on the USA and its allies. Because trade is a two-way street. Just as much as China depends on the USA to buy exports, the USA depends on China to provide those imports. Fair point. But, well, this is where things get kind of complicated, so let's try to simplify it a bit. We have to understand why the US and most of the world is buying so much from China, and not other countries like India or Vietnam. More often than not, it's about cost. For the better part of the 21st century, China has been the cheapest place to manufacture stuff. That's it. This is not the case of China being the only country selling these products, and we're beholden to the CCP if we want to get our cheap electronics. We are getting these because they are the cheapest. There are many other countries like India and Vietnam who would gladly take over the world's manufacturing if China were to, for any reason, stop. In fact, here's the list of the top 10 US exports. The biggest ones here are devices like iPhones and tablets. Apple, in fact, has already started diversifying their supply chain out of China into friendlier countries like India. And it's not just Apple. Here's a list of companies that have already started to leave China, and this list will only grow from here. This all doesn't mean China won't use exports as a leverage if it were to face sanctions. It most definitely will, because that's the biggest leverage it has. But manufacturing cheap products is easily replaceable. Sure, companies and citizens might face short-term disruptions, but everyone will soon find a new place to manufacture. China, on the other hand, has a lot more riding on this trade. More than $500 billion in revenue comes from these exports for Chinese companies. But jobs are where the real problems begin. Now, this data was really hard to find, so please hit that like button if you appreciate all the effort we've been putting into these videos. Also, let me put in this disclaimer. Much like any data from China, always take it with a grain of salt, because you know the CCP has a habit of misrepresenting facts. So China has around 120 million jobs in manufacturing, and around 20% of goods manufactured in China come to the United States. So let's assume if this trade is halted, 20% of the jobs will be affected. That's 24 million people quite possibly losing their jobs. And whenever it comes to the economy in real life, no event is standalone. There are always far-reaching effects. We have to remember one man's spending is another man's income. So, if 20+ million people stop spending because they don't have a job, other people's income will go down, and this will all have big catastrophic consequences on the economy. Again, I want to point out that these are not exact numbers, but at least you get the idea of the scale of the problem. Now, this is all just considering sanctions from the United States. It's more than likely that some European countries will join these sanctions, and quite possibly some big Asian countries too, so the effects on China's economy could be catastrophic if that was ever the case. And this will only worsen another problem that China has been having: wealth inequality. That's right. A lot of people complain that wealth inequality is a result of capitalism, and wealth would be equally distributed in communism. Well, I have some bad news for those people. China isn't much better when it comes to the divide between rich and poor, and this is based on data published by the CCP. So things could be worse than they let on. Karl Marx would be rolling in his grave. The COVID shutdown has only made these problems worse, and the recent real estate crash in China is hurting middle-class households the most. So if there is ever an economic slowdown caused by sanctions, middle-class Chinese citizens would pose the most danger to the authoritarian rule of the CCP, and hundreds of billions of dollars spent on internal security might not be enough. So things are not all well at home for the CCP. While screaming war might distract the citizens, starting a war is definitely not the solution. Economically, China cannot afford a war, but that hasn't really stopped authoritarian leaders from starting one before. That's the problem when the entire nation's decision-making rests in one person's hands. Jack Ma faced this reality recently when he made the mistake of calling out Xi Jinping and learned the hard way that the government controls everything in China, even billion-dollar companies. If you want to learn how the CCP destroyed Jack Ma's legacy overnight, I highly recommend you check out this video on my friend's new channel and show him some support.